Good evening. So we're picking up chapter 2 of Pirkei Avos, and we are starting from Mishnah number 6, Mishnah Vav. And this is a very interesting Mishnah. It is the first of its kind, I think, that we've seen, meaning this Mishnah kind of tells I can't even call it a story, but it recounts an event, an occurrence. And the Mishnah says, it's talking still about Hillel the elder, Hillel the great, and it says that Afhu ra'a gulgoles achas shetzafa pnei hamayim, that he once saw a skull floating on the water. Amar la, and he said to the skull, Al da'ataftef atfuch, because you drowned you drowned someone else, so you were drowned. V'sof, and in the end, mitifayich yetufun, those who drowned you will drown too, will get drowned. So he sees the skull and a human, from a human head, and he says that because you drowned others, you were drowned, and those who drowned you will be drowned. So what is this Mishnah trying to tell us? So it seems, at least at face value, that this Mishnah is teaching us the concept of midah keneged midah, measure for measure, that God judges measure for measure, and not even simply measure, not just generally measure for measure, but very specifically. So Hillel sees the skull, and he says that it's not just that the skull, you killed someone, so therefore you got killed, but you must have drowned someone, so therefore you got drowned. And and it's exactly as you did to others, that's what occurred to you. And what occurred to you is going to occur to the one who did it to you, so as well. So that's the Mishnah at face value. Now, there are two very basic questions that the Midrash Shmuel raises on this Mishnah, and they are as follows. The first question is that how could Hillel say with conviction that those who drowned you in the end will drown? He says, we find all the time that people do evil things like drowning someone, and they don't get drowned. They seemingly don't get punished with measure for measure the same punishment and or equal punishment. They die comfortably in their beds. You can have a murderer. Unfortunately, there are murderers in the world, and they don't always get exactly what they did to others. There have been murderers who murdered and then died in their beds comfortably. So just how could Hillel say with conviction that those he sees the skull, he says, whoever drowned you is going to get it back at them, measure for measure, they're going to be drowned. So to this, the Midrash Shmuel says, that question we could deal with. That question we could say that there's a concept of Gilgul, of reincarnation, that a soul can visit this world, and then if it didn't accomplish its mission, it may have to return to this world. Or if it was deserving of some punishment or experience in this world, it may have to return to this world. So he says, perhaps when Hillel said to the skull, those who drowned you will drown, but it doesn't always happen. We find that some people drown people and don't drown. But what he's really saying is they'll get it to them eventually, whether it's in this visit to the world or in a subsequent reincarnation, a Gilgul, when their soul comes back another time. Then if they don't get it now, they could get it then. And that concept actually is a way of approaching many difficult questions about, people seem to suffer when they don't deserve it. And it could be that it could be, I mean, there's different ways to deal with this question, and it's not, and I'm sure the answer isn't always the same, and we don't know, and we'll never know really. But one approach, one way to understand, sometimes when a person suffers, it could be that even though they didn't deserve it in this visit to, of their soul to this round, this go around, but it could be that they are living out the consequence of something that the soul experienced or did in a previous incarnation, and that's one way to explain it. But here we see the opposite, where Hillel is saying that God works measure for measure, and therefore, if whoever drowned this person, this skull that I see now, will get measure for measure either in this incarnation or in another reincarnation. Now, it still doesn't fully answer the question, because I think we still need to say it's not, when we say measure for measure, it's not always so exact, because we can find that somebody will, let's say, drown someone and then they'll get punished, but it won't be drowning, it'll be something else. So it could be the equivalent, but I don't know if it's always exactly the same, unless somehow he's saying that no, it will be, if not in this visit, then in a subsequent visit. So that's how he wants to deal with that first question. The first question is, how could he say with conviction, whoever drowned you will be drowned? We don't see that. We see people who do things like that and they don't get punished. And his answer is, the Midrash Shmuel says that if it doesn't happen now, it will happen in another visit of the soul and a reincarnation. He says, but there's another question. And this question is even stronger, he says. And that is that he sees this skull floating. And he says, if you were drowned, it must be that you drowned someone else, because God is just, and if not for the fact that you drowned someone, you wouldn't have been drowned. So in a way, he's saying that anytime somebody gets drowned, it must be that they drowned someone else. So besides for that, that's not either true, right? Because there have been people who drowned who didn't drown other people, but just even logically, it wouldn't make sense, because if you go back, there, at some point there must be someone who drowned who didn't drown anyone. In other words, even if we could imagine that it was true throughout, but if you so somebody got drowned, it must be that he drowned someone else, and that someone else got drowned, so he must have drowned someone else. And you go back and back and back, eventually you're going to come to someone who drowned, who didn't drown someone else, because who was the first one to drown someone? Kind of like we go back to King and Abel, to Cain and Hevel. So Hevel gets killed by his brother Cain, his brother Cain. Did Hevel kill anyone? No, he hadn't killed anyone, right? He was the first one to be killed. So at some point, there's going to be a starting point. So just the assumption, he sees a skull that drowned, and he says, oh, if you drowned, it must be that you drowned someone else. So besides for that, we see that that's not the case always. But in addition to that, just logically, it can't make sense, because eventually, if you work back, even if it was true for a series of people, eventually there's going to be someone who was the first one to be drowned, and the person who did the drowning will be punished by drowning, but that first person who got drowned didn't drown anyone. So that's the logical fallacy of this assumption that Hillel seems to be making. So that's the second question raised by the Midrash Shmuel. And he says perhaps the resolution to that is that actually Hillel knew whose skull this was. When he saw the skull and he said, it's because you drowned others that you were drowned, he wasn't saying that every time someone drowns, it's because that person drowned others. People have been drowned, and it wasn't because they drowned others. But this particular skull, he recognized, he knew who this was. This was the bandit who drowned people, right? He recognized the face. So that's why he was able to turn to this skull and say that you got measure for measure, you got what you deserved, because you were someone who drowned others, and that's why you were drowned. However, there is another way that he offers to approach this Mishnah, which perhaps simplifies it a little bit. And that is that when he says that you drowned because you drowned others, and he says v'sof, and in the end, mitifayach yitufun, those who drowned you will be drowned. So he asks an additional question, which is that if in fact this person had drowned others, and that's why he was punished, that he was drowned, so does it really make sense to say, and those who drowned you will drown? Why? They just drowned the guy who was the bandit who drowned people. So do they really deserve to be punished for that? They were maybe doing a service to the world, right? Drowning the drowner. So he says there's another way to read the Mishnah, and that is that the word vi, which is usually and, sometimes means or. And so we could read the Mishnah to be, instead of and those who drowned you will be drowned, to being or. And that way, the Mishnah reads as follows. He saw the skull that was floating, and he said, basically, there's two possibilities. Either you are being punished because you drowned others, or if you're not being punished because you drowned others and you were not deserving of this, so then those who did this to you will be punished and they will be drowned. And it's still not always the case. It could be, again, that they'll be drowned in another incarnation, right? It doesn't have to be in this visit, but that kind of, I think, resolves a lot of the issues. And again, he's just, I think, still speaking about the idea of measure for measure, that God deals with people measure for measure. And so he says, again, the way that that this other alternative reading of the Mishnah is that it's an or. So he sees a skull floating, and he says, either this came about because you drowned others, and this was your punishment, or if it wasn't and you weren't deserving of this, so then those who drowned you will be drowned because they will be punished for it, measure for measure. So that's the Mishnah. Interesting Mishnah. But again, I think the key message here is that God judges measure for measure, although we don't always understand or see how exactly God's workings are carried out. Okay. Next Mishnah. Mishnah Zayin. Mishnah 7. Okay, a lot more going on in this Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Hu haya omer, he used to say. So again, this is Hillel talking. He used to say, Mar be basar, mar berima. A person who has, the more flesh a person has, the more corpulent a person is, the more rima, the more worms will eat away that flesh after the person dies. Mar be nechasim, mar be de'aga. The more possessions a person has, the more they have to worry about. Mar be nashim, mar be kshafim. The more wives a man has, the more witchcraft that will be going on. Interesting line. Mar be shefachos, mar be zima. The more female slaves a person has, the more lewdness, sexual impropriety, etc., that will be going on. Mar be avadim, the more slaves, the more male slaves a person has. Mar be gezel, the more stealing that will be going on. But so those are all the things that really the Mishnah is saying we should not have too much of. We should not be seeking. But what should we seek? Mar be Torah, mar be chayim. The more Torah one has, the more life one has. Mar be yeshiva, mar be chachma. The more one sits and studies, the more wisdom one gets. Mar be etza, the more counsel. I think on a simple level, it means the more counsel one seeks from others. Mar be tevuna, the more understanding one has. Mar be tzedakah, the more charity. Mar be shalom, the more peace. And then it concludes, kana shem tov, kana la'atzmo. Person acquires a good name, he acquires it for himself. Kana lo divrei Torah, a person acquires words of Torah. Kana lo chaye halam haba, he acquires life in the world to come. Okay, so jam-packed Mishnah. We have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, actually, I'm not sure I'm counting right, but many different little points being made, and each one we need to discuss separately. So the opening line is Marbe Basar, Marbe Rima. Person has the more flesh, the more worms that will consume that flesh after the person passes. So I think we have to appreciate that in earlier times, flesh and corpulence was something that was considered, beautiful and something that people saw. So I think that this would be speaking in such a society, and where people would deliberately want to become obese, corpulent, and so it's speaking to someone who's looking to add flesh, and to do so through enjoying lots and lots of food. So the Mishnah says that that actually the result of that is more there's just more flesh to be consumed after the person passes, meaning it's not something that's of any value to a person just to increase their flesh. That's not something that actually the opposite, that's more to be consumed after death. And he quotes, the Midrash Shmuel quotes from Rabbi Yehuda ibn Shushan, interesting idea. So there's a statement in the Talmud that says that worms to a dead body are as painful as needles to living flesh. So taken literally, this sounds like the person, even after death, they experience pain from the worms that consume their flesh, just like needles to a living person. But says Rabbi Yehuda ibn Shushan, that's not what it means, because that's not the case. A person does not feel anything on their flesh after death. So what are the sages trying to teach us when they say that worms on a dead body are as painful as needles to living flesh? So they are teaching us about the concept of nivul hames, the desecration of a dead body. So we're very careful about how we deal with the dead, very, very respectfully. And so, we clean the body before burial, and we're very careful, and we don't, and we specifically only bury the body, but also he's making the point that still inevitably there will be some nivul, some desecration of the body that occurs in the grave, and that comes about because the body deteriorates and rots and is consumed by worms or bacteria. So therefore, he said what the Mishnah actually could be saying is that the more flesh a person has, so the more there is there to be desecrated after death. And so when the sages say that it's painful for the worms after death are as painful as a needle to a person's flesh when they're alive, it's not saying that you literally feel that pain, but when we're alive, we should be pained by the idea that our bodies will be desecrated eventually in that way. And therefore, a person should not aim for corpulence, for having a lot of flesh, even though, again, in that society, that was considered beautiful and something that somebody might seek. But the Mishnah is saying, no, don't seek that. That actually leads to more nivul hames, more desecration of the dead after death. And so having additional flesh is not a good thing. And therefore a person should limit their consumption and try to keep the weight off, basically. So that's the first line. Marbe basar, marbe rima. Person increases their flesh, they increase the worms. I think maybe on the most basic level, though, what that line is just saying is, again, that although in that society it was considered beautiful, and therefore people sought to become corpulent and would eat a lot in order to do that, but that's chasing after the pleasures of this world. And the Mishnah is warning that, that's a pleasure that in the end, it turns into something, disgusting, we can say, because it just means that there's more flesh to be consumed after death. Okay. Then the Mishnah says, marbe nechasim, marbe daga. The more possessions a person has, the more worry a person has. And this is something that is both obvious, we could say, once somebody points it out. It makes a lot of sense, but very important, right? Because so many people spend their lives just trying to amass more and more. But the Mishnah is saying, what you're really, the more you amass, really is just, you're just getting more and more things to worry about, more and more anxiety. So people celebrate when they get more possessions, but in fact, the Mishnah is saying that they're just really adding more worry to their lives. There's many things a person might worry about when they have lots of possessions. They'll worry about maybe it will get stolen, or maybe it will get lost or ruined. Maybe it could become a target for bandits, for robbers, because they have much. So we shouldn't consider it, a great thing to try to amass many possessions. The Bartanura quotes a little story. He says that there was a certain person who would pray that God should save me from the scattering of my soul. That's what he would pray. God should save me from the scattering of my soul. So people asked him, what does that even mean? What do you mean, the scattering of your soul? So he said he was praying that he shouldn't have so many possessions that would be scattered around, because that would scatter him, meaning that would mean that his mind would always be in different places, because he'd be worrying about this and worrying about that, this property and that property and this stock and that stock, and he wouldn't be able to function and focus on life itself. So he prayed that he should not have many possessions and he should not be scattered in that way. Okay. Then the Mishnah says, marbe shifachos, marbe zima. Person has a lot of female slaves, so that causes lewdness. Either the owner of the slaves is involved in acts of sexual impropriety. It could be that not him, but others, as a result of having these women around. So that's something also that's warned against. And then it also says that if a person has a lot of slaves, male slaves, again, we're dealing with this, is, obviously very foreign to us, but a society where this was normal, but yet the Mishnah is warning against it and saying it's not a good idea. And it says that somebody who has a lot of male slaves, so they're going to have a lot of stealing. So who's going to be doing the stealing? So it could be, I think the most simple reading is that the slaves will do the stealing, especially since they probably think that they deserve to be paid for what they're doing. So they'll take a little bit to account for what they think that they deserve. Alternatively, it could be that they just don't respect, they want to find favor in their master's eyes. So he gives them sheep to graze. They find a place to graze, even if it's somebody else's property. So they're not stealing for themselves, but they might be stealing on behalf of their master to curry favor with their master, to be doing a good job. It could be that the master now has a lot of slaves. He has to feed them somehow, right? So he has to steal in order to be able to provide for his for all of his own slaves, both the men and the women. So that it could be that it's he who is going to do the stealing. Midrash Shmuel quotes a very fascinating comment by Rabbi Yehuda ibn Shushan, who says that, and it's a play on words a little bit. It's not saying this is the simple understanding, but he said that perhaps it can mean that a person who has a lot of slaves, they're stealing from the poor people, the Jewish poor, who they should be hiring and giving jobs to. So a person has slaves that they own, working for free, so to speak. But as a result, they don't have to hire any help, and that will cause a loss to the poor people who need those jobs. And so that's who you're stealing from. By having slaves, you're stealing from the poor who you could be supporting instead. This is just interesting in terms of, from an economics perspective. There's nowadays we have the question about automation and machines and sort of taking over in the workplace, automated checkout, people losing jobs as a result. So this is kind of the equivalent. And he's saying you're stealing from the poor by automating things, by having free labor through slaves. This was actually part of maybe a small part of a dispute a couple hundred years ago when the machine matzah was first coming on the scene. So machine matzah, when it first was introduced, with the Industrial Revolution, some shortly after that. So there were a lot of issues that with the machines then when they were first made. The biggest one was a chametz issue, because they couldn't be cleaned out as well as they could now. Now there's no chametz issue, but when the machines were first invented for baking matzah, they had issues that some of the dough would get trapped somewhere, and there could be issues of chametz. That was one of the main reasons why some opposed machine matzah. But an argument, I think it was made by Rabbi Shlomo Kluger, my colleague Rabbi Grossman sometimes quotes this, was part of his many arguments against the machine matzah was also the jobs, that if you now start to use machines, so then all the poor widows who used to work in the matzah factory, in the matzah bakery, are going to lose their jobs. So it's a question for the economists whether ultimately, that's an argument that makes sense. You could just say, okay, we'll produce more and we'll provide for them through social programs. So that's the question itself. But this reading of the Mishnah is basically that type of argument. According to Rabbi Yehuda ibn Shushan, he says that the more slaves one has, the more gezel, the more stealing. Who is it stealing from? It's stealing from the poor, who the person would be hiring if not for that he owned slaves, and that's hurtful to them. So that's another way to read this Mishnah. Okay, again, very foreign to us because we don't live in that type of society. But what we do see is, even though the Torah, of course, has laws regarding slaves, and there's such a concept, and although we do, according to Torah law, they get treated quite well, but still, this Mishnah is really saying it's something that is discouraged. It's not a good idea. It leads to all sorts of issues. Okay, then the Mishnah then turns to the sort of the positive side of things, what a person should aim for. So it said, if you have a lot of Torah, you have a lot of life. I guess most basic level, it just enhances a person's life. It could mean life in the world to come. It doesn't seem to mean that, because later the Mishnah mentions the world to come. But even in this, in this world, Torah adds so much to our lives. And then it says, Marbe Yeshiva, Marbe Chachma. The more one sits and studies, so the more wisdom that they can gain. And so that could just mean, sitting and studying, we gain wisdom. It can also mean that, there's some versions of this Mishnah that actually flip it. And they say, Marbe Chachma, Marbe Yeshiva. The more wisdom one has, the more yeshiva one has. What does that mean? It means a yeshiva is also like a place where people come to study. So the more wisdom someone has, the more students they can acquire. And then it says, marbe eitza, marbe tvuna. The more advice, or the more counsel, so the more understanding. Now that also could be understood both ways. It could mean the more that we seek advice, the more understanding we have. Now the word understanding is kind of a rough translation of the word tivuna. Tivuna comes from the root bina. Bina we translate as understanding, but it really means the ability to what's the word I'm looking for? To basically take an idea and build on it.
Synthesize?
No, not synthesize. Extrapolate. That's what I'm looking for. To extrapolate, where you can take an idea and really build off of it. So that's usually how we understand what bina is. It relates to the word boneh, which means to build, or binyan is a building. So the idea is, and that's what the word tivuna also comes from. So if a person seeks counsel, so then they can extrapolate, they can build off of that. And it's the idea of really, when we seek counsel, so we're shown different ways to look at things. And so besides for the, maybe we want to know what to do, right? So in a given situation, so we seek counsel and we're given a direction, but usually, hopefully, it's not simply like do this, right? There's a perspective and a way to look at things that helps us understand the recommendation. And the truth is that the best type of counsel is where the counselor, the person giving the guidance, helps us see why, or really helps us arrive at the decision on our own. So really we have a question, what should I do? I have the given situation. I want to know what I should do. So a good, guidance counselor, someone who's giving us guidance, really the best thing they could do is show us the consequences of each decision, or the maybe reasons behind it. Help us kind of arrive at the decision on our own by just showing us new perspective on the situation. And so that's to give us sort of not just an answer of what to do. We can't build off of that. Should I do this or that? Do this. Okay, now, but the next time I'm not going to know what to do. But if a person gives us guidance where they're helping to give us perspective on the matter, so that's something I can build off of. That's something I can reuse in another situation. So the more counsel that we seek, the more bina, the more understanding, or the more we have an ability to take that and use it in other situations. That's one way to look at that. We can also look at the opposite, that it's not saying the more we seek counsel, but rather the more that we give counsel. Not recommending that we go around telling everybody what to do, but when we're in a situation where we are in position to give advice, so we can either give that advice without careful consideration, or we can give it only after careful consideration. And that careful consideration will help us build our own understanding if we, again, contemplate. It's funny, the word contemplate also has the same root, mitbonein in Hebrew. It also involves like building. So it's really thinking about something and building up an idea. And if we're in the position of counseling and we're doing it carefully with thought, that itself could give us wisdom as we kind of process and search through a given situation and try to arrive at a good counsel for the person who's asking. So marbe eitza, marbe tivuna, somebody who has a lot of counsel, gains a lot of understanding, either when they seek counsel from others, or even if they're involved in giving counsel, but it gives them a chance to really consider things carefully, and they can build understanding through that. Okay, and then the Mishnah then closes with a couple of statements. Well, actually, no, first it says, marbe tzedakah, marbe shalom. The more charity a person gives, the more they increase peace. And we'll come back to that actually shortly to explain that. And then it says, Kana Shem Tov, Kana La'atzmo. If a person acquires a good name, they acquire it for themselves. So I guess it's saying a good name is something that we own it. We've worked on it, and it's our own, and it's intrinsic almost. It's not something that we acquire possessions. We don't acquire that for ourselves. It's something that's outside of us. But a good name is something that becomes a part of us. Kana lo divrei Torah, kana lo chaye ha'olam haba. A person acquires Torah, so then they acquire the world to come. To acquire Torah means to work on something and to inculcate it and to try to assimilate the idea within ourselves. And as a result, that is a merit for the world to come. The more we are in touch with we are coming close to God through Torah study, we're learning God's ways. So that is something that is an acquisition for life in the world to come. Okay, so that's just a basic one by one. Some of them I kind of glossed over, but I'm going to come back to them now as we discuss an approach that kind of looks at things together. So so the Midrash Shmuel, after quoting all these ideas from other commentaries, the Midrash Shmuel says that I think the Mishnah may be saying as follows. The Mishnah is telling us that there are 4 things that people chase after in this world, that we're better off achieving them in other ways, let's say. So the first is a person chases after food and drink and pleasures. So just pleasures that we can imbibe, and we become a little bit obsessed with it almost. And he says regarding this type of pursuit of pleasure, so the Mishnah is telling us that, remember, marbe basar marbe rima. The more flesh we add, the more corpulence, so the more worms we have after we die. And he says specifically it's talking about someone who is seeking this. Somebody is seeking to add flesh, not someone who is not seeking it and it just comes. He goes out of his way to say that, but because there have been, he says, plenty of people who put on weight not deliberately, and that's not who it's talking about. It's talking about, again, in the society where corpulence was seen as something beautiful and a sign of wealth and a sign of success. And so somebody who seeks that should remember that just increases the like we said before, the desecration of the body after death by deterioration, and just more that will deteriorate after we die. The second type of pleasure a person chases in this world is money. Person chases wealth, and people obsess about it, and something, they stay up late at night thinking about how they can get more and more. And to that it says, the more possessions we have, the more worry. Person worries that they not lose their wealth. They worry that it not go to waste. So they don't want to lose it. They want to use it. So they buy things that they don't need, because otherwise, there's nothing that they'll do with it. Or they travel around trying to build that wealth, right? So you have money, you got to invest it, you got to make more out of it, right? So a person has a lot of money, so they work harder so that they can use that money to get more money. He says also, but we worry. So a person has money and they're in position to make a deal and to purchase merchandise, and they don't, and then that merchandise goes up and they're all upset with themselves that they missed a chance to make a lot of money. Or the opposite, they have merchandise and they have an opportunity to sell it and they miss it, and then it goes down in value, and now they're all upset about that. So there's a lot of anguish and anxiety that can come about through possessions. That's the second type of pursuit that people have. The third one is people chase after sexual pleasures, and that could be within the bounds of Jewish law or outside the bounds, but even within the bounds. So, and again, this is no longer within the bounds, but according to Torah law, a man can marry more than one wife. And although later we have a decree that we no longer can, at least for most sections of Jews. But there's but by Torah law one can't. So the Mishnah talks about a man who marries more than one wife, but that could just be someone who's seeking that type of pleasure. And the Mishnah warns that if you one who has many wives, so there's lots of witchcraft, kishafim, which is a very interesting line, obviously, to us. But even if we, accept at face value, so there's going to be witchcraft. But why? Why does having a lot of wives lead to witchcraft? So he says that the idea is that if a person has many wives, so they are in competition with each other for his favor, and as a result, they will use their kishafim, their witchcraft. I don't know if that's probably meant to be literal, but maybe it could even be not literal, but just to use their different methods to try to curry his favor. And as a result, he suggests that that will negatively affect him. And how does he say it? He's going to say it later, what the effect is going to be, but it's basically going to affect his mind as a result. Again, it sounds like he's taking it literally, that their witchcraft will then, they're going to use witchcraft against him to curry his favor, to get him to like, each one will try to get him to like her more, and then he'll end up with sort of a messed up brain as a result, and so he'll end up much less wise, more stupid than he started. So that's the warning against that. And then the fourth type of pleasure a person seeks is honor. And so a person thinks, if I have a lot of slaves, so that makes me look really good. And so he tries to have a lot of slaves, men, women, maidservants, and to that, we said that increases the lewdness and increases stealing. And that's also not a good idea. So those are the four things that the Mishnah opens with, four things that a person might try to seek, and that is, number one, physical pleasures of food and drink. Number two is money. Number three is physical pleasures, sexual pleasures. And number four is honor, which could be achieved through having a lot of slaves. That's how the Mishnah opens. And to that, then the Mishnah says those are four things that a person should not be seeking. And instead, the Mishnah gives us other ways that we could kind of satisfy ourselves in a proper way and end up much better off. And that is as follows. So instead of chasing after flesh, and instead of chasing after pleasures, delicious foods, and obsessing about that, a person is much better off chasing after Torah. And he says that's where you add life. If you want to add life, it's not through food. Obviously, food sustains us, but you want life. So marbe Torah, marbe chayim. That's what gives life, as opposed to flesh and corpulence. That just gives worms after death. But really, instead, a person should chase after Torah. And that's the tree of life, rather than chase after money. So to that, the Mishnah says, again, a person who chases after money has lots of worries. It says, marbe yeshiva. You should increase yeshiva. Yeshiva, we said, could mean sitting and studying. It could also mean having students or supporting students. That's where a person should put their money. Instead of amassing money, take the money you have and invest it in yeshiva in Torah in Torah students, and that will be a much better use of your money. And as a result, you'll increase wisdom, whether for yourself or for others, maybe as a merit in that you increase others. The way he says it actually is that even you'll be increasing the wisdom of others, of the Torah students that you're supporting, but you'll be in your merit. So it'll be as if you increased your own wisdom. That's much better rather than try to amass great wealth. Taking your money and trying to just get more and more money. Use your money, invest it in Torah institutions to build Torah students, and instead of worrying over your money, you'll have wisdom from as a result of that. You'll merit wisdom, and wisdom brings joy. So instead of worry, you'll have joy. Person tries to amass more and more money, all they end up with is worry. A person takes their money and gives it to Torah institutions to increase wisdom. So not only is the wisdom of others increased, but their own wisdom could be increased as a merit, and they ultimately will be joyful because wisdom increases joy. Corresponding to the third type of pursuit, the pursuit of wives. So to that person, it says that you should increase in counsel, and then you'll increase in understanding. So as I mentioned before, the way that he understands the idea of the wives and witchcraft is that they'll try their witchcraft on him to curry favor, and in the end, that will actually affect his thinking, and that will make him stupid as a result. So rather than have many wives, he's much better off going in the other direction and spending time seeking counsel and giving counsel maybe, and that way he'll increase his wisdom instead of decreasing his wisdom. And corresponding to the person who chases after honor by having many slaves and maidservants, so to that it says marbet tzedakah, increase in charity. You'll bring poor people into your house and support them, and they can serve you. You'll pay them, you'll hire them. So this we alluded to before, but this is how he learns it actually, is that instead of this does correspond. It says instead of having many slaves, marbet tzedakah, do much charity, take your money and put it towards supporting the poor, and then you'll increase peace. In what way will you increase peace? So first of all, he says that, actually not first of all, but what he says is that you'll increase peace between the poor and God, because when the poor are not being supported, then they're crying out to God and they're upset with their lot potentially, and there's not peace between them and God. But if you begin to support them and you act as the emissary of God to provide for them, so that will create peace between them and God. So marbet tzedakah, marbet shalom. So the more tzedakah, the more charity, the more peace we make between those who are experiencing difficulty and God. So that's the four things, and the four things that correspond. So four things that people chase after. People chase after physical pleasures like food and drink. To that it says, chase after Torah, increase Torah. That will bring you life. That will bring you joy. People chase after possessions, money. That brings them worry. Instead, you should chase after supporting yeshiva, supporting Torah, and that will bring you wisdom, and that will bring you joy. Instead of chasing after many wives, which will bring kishafim, will bring witchcraft, and will make a person ultimately to lose their thinking ability, their intelligence. So on the opposite end, you should increase counsel to increase your understanding. And somebody who seeks honor by seeking slaves and maidservants, so instead they should increase in tzedakah, in charity, support the poor, and that will create peace between the poor and God. And then the Mishnah closes with four things, and there are four different things according to the way that he's reading it. There's kana shem tov, he acquires a good name. So we read it before. If he acquires a good name, kana la'atmo, he acquires it for himself. That those two things were connected. Midrash Shmuel is saying they're not connected. They're separate things, and each one of these last four things are going back on the four things that we mentioned before. So first it says, kana shem tov, he acquires a good name. That's talking about the person who gives a lot of charity. You give a lot of charity, you'll acquire a good name. That's what happens, someone who's generous. So people think well of that person, which is a fine thing. You acquire a good name. And then it said, kana la'atzmo, you acquire it for yourself. It's not talking about the good name, he says. That's going back on the person who seeks counsel. Somebody who increases in eitzah, in counsel, and increases their understanding as a result. So such a person acquires it. That understanding is their own. They acquire that for themselves. The understanding is something that becomes a part of them. And then we had that there's the person who has a lot of wives, and they compete for him, and etc. So they do their witchcraft on him, and they make him depressed, and they cause him to lose his intelligence. So such a person ponders suicide. He says it's a hard life when that's the situation, and so to that. That's how he's reading it. He's saying if instead of doing that, a person seeks counsel, so they acquire themselves, meaning they save their own life by doing that, rather than having a lot of wives, which creates this depressing situation, so which may cause a person to become suicidal. So instead, they should increase in counsel, which then makes them wise, but also they acquire themselves, meaning they'll save their life that way. Okay, it's creative, but he's trying to connect all the dots here. And then he says that with regards to the person who uses his money to support Torah students, so to that it says he acquires divrei Torah, he acquires words of Torah, because the Torah that they learn on his dime, in his merit, so that becomes like his, because he's supporting them. So in supporting their Torah study, he is acquiring that Torah for himself. And then finally, we said that a person who increases in Torah increases life. And to that, the last point of the Mishnah is that actually that's talking about life in the world to come. That the last line is kana lo chayil mabah, he has earned for himself the world to come. So these last four things are corresponding to the four things that were discussed. The person who gives tzedakah, kana shem tov, acquires a good name. The person who seeks counsel and doesn't have too many wives, kana la'atzmo, acquires himself, saves his own life. The person who supports yeshiva, supports Torah study, kana lo divrei Torah, acquires words of Torah, acquires the merits of all that Torah that's studied. And the person who increases Torah on their own, so that person acquires life. The Mishnah says it means they acquire life in the world to come. That's how the Midrash Shmuel takes all these parts of the Mishnah and connects them. Okay. We have 5 more minutes, and let's use those 5 minutes. We'll do the last Mishnah, Mishnah Ches. So this is another one of those Mishnahs that's very long, and it's broken up different ways. Some counting as 2 Mishnahs. We're going to count it as 1. It's Mishnah Ches, number 8, but I only included on the source sheet, if that's what you're using, the first line of it. And it could be that if you're using your own Mishnah, your own Avos, it may already be broken up for you. And it may be Mishnah 9 also. But for us, it's 8. And it says, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai kibel me Hillel min Shammai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai received the tradition from Hillel and Shammai. Hu haya omer. He used to say, Im lamadata Torah harbe. If you learned a lot of Torah, al tachzik tova la'atzmecha. Don't, how do we translate it here? Don't, take credit for it. Because this is why you were created. You were created for this. So a person who has learned a lot of Torah, he says, don't take credit for it because you were created for this. So quickly, just a few approaches to explain what this means. So the first is that on the most basic level, that this is our mission. Our mission, our purpose is to fulfill God's will, to fulfill the mitzvos. God created us. He gave us everything. He gave us life. He gives us, everything in this world. And we just have a simple task, which is to do his will. And that's what we were created for. And we owe it to God to do his will. So we shouldn't be claiming credit for learning a lot of Torah and carrying out God's will, because that's what we were just doing our job, basically. That's what we were created for. And it's nothing, it's not a drop in the bucket in terms of what we actually owe God for all that he gives to us and all the opportunity he gives to us. So there's nothing to be, not that we shouldn't be proud of what we do, but we shouldn't be like, okay, I look, God, I did it, right? What else do you want from me? But we can always be doing more. That's, I think, the most basic understanding. An interesting way to read this alternative read is that it relates actually to that explanation, is that what it's saying is a person who learns a lot of Torah shouldn't take credit and say, for this I was created. Meaning, he shouldn't say, I was created for this and I did it. Look, I'm done. Right? I learned a lot of Torah. I've made it. Lekach notzarta. This is what you were created for. This is what I was created for, and I've made it. I'm done. I'm yotze. I fulfilled my obligation. No, that's not. That's a person shouldn't say that. That's not God's intent. We always have to keep striving and keep going. Another explanation. If a person has learned a lot of Torah, al tachzik tova la'atzmecha could mean, tachzik can mean like to hold on to. Instead of meaning to take credit for, it could mean to hold on to the good for yourself. Don't hold on to the good for yourself. If you've learned a lot of Torah, don't just hold it to yourself. You have to share it with others. And so, this is what you were created for. You were created for, we were all created really to be able to share with others. And so if you learned a lot of Torah, don't hold it to yourself. Don't hold the goodness to yourself, but rather share it with others. And finally, one more explanation. If the Mishnah could be saying that if you learned a lot of Torah, don't feel the need to grab good from elsewhere. Al tachzik tov l'atzmecha. You don't need to grab good from elsewhere as if it's running away from you, as if it's hard to come by, because you were created for this. This is as good as it gets. This is where you'll find goodness, fulfilling God's will, and drawing close to God. This is where the goodness is. So if you've learned a lot of Torah, you don't have to try going to find goodness elsewhere. Al tachzik tov l'atzmecha. Don't try to grab onto goodness somewhere else. Because you were created for this. This is what we were created for, to be able to fulfill God's will through all mitzvos, but Torah study as well, or especially, and that's where the blessing truly lies. So quickly to sum up, we just offered quickly 4 explanations for this teaching. If you've learned a lot of Torah, don't claim credit for yourself because you were created for this. Number 1, this is we owe so much to God, and don't say, oh, look, look God, look what I did. I learned a lot of Torah. Look, I've accomplished so much, and really, with the thinking that, what do I owe you anymore? Because we always owe God. We owe so much to God for all that He provides for us. And this is what we were created for, but we're not done. There's always more to do. It could also be that this is what the person might say. They might say, I was created for this and I've done it. I fulfilled it. So to that we say, no, don't claim credit for yourself and say, I was created for this and I'm done. Alternatively, it could mean that that don't hold the goodness to yourself. If you've learned a lot of Torah, don't hold it for yourself, because this is what you were created for, to share it with others. And finally, if you've learned a lot of Torah, don't try to grab good for yourself from elsewhere, because this is what you were created for, and this is where the ultimate good lies, is in the study of Torah and in the fulfillment of God's will. Okay.